It's the 2nd of September 2005. The West Coast Eagles are hosting the Sydney Swans in the second qualifying final. The stakes are already high. This is a chance to get a week off and get a home preliminary final. But little do the players, coaching staff, commentators and spectators know that we're about to experience the birth of something much bigger. This is just the first of a 6-game run that will span 3 seasons and encompass 2 grand finals, 2 qualifying finals and 2 nail-biters during the regular season. The winning margin of this game tonight, 4 points, is going to be the highest of the entire series. So if the fans are feeling stressed out now, they better know a good doctor. These 2 teams from other sides of the country have no obvious link, apart from their mascots both having feathers and sharing the sky. But their destinies, history and future will be forever tied after tonight. Legends will be made, droughts will be broken, games and moments will live on forever, hearts will break and likely stop as well, tears of joy and sadness will be shed. This is the start of the perfect rivalry. But before we go any further, it's important to remind ourselves of how we've even gotten to this point. The West Coast Eagles were introduced as one of the league's 2 new expansion teams, set to debut in the 1987 season. It continued the expansion of the then Victorian League into a national competition. There was definitely still some tension and rivalry that lingered from the previous State of Origin matches between Victoria and Western Australia, with many of the Eagles' initial squad coming from the Waffle. Many of Western Australia's star players had previously been headhunted by the Victorian clubs, and after being kept out of the league for so long, it was finally time for the West to make its mark, and the Eagles quickly made up for lost time. In 1991, just their 5th season in the league, they were the minor premiers and made a grand final. They go one better the next season and win their first premiership, and they do that again in 1994. But with like a lot of great teams, a natural decline is inevitable as key players start to retire or leave. Mick Malthouse, the coach of those premiership teams, famously departed in a shiny new Lexus to go join Collingwood at the end of the century. But from the ashes of that great first Eagles team, a new one starts to rise. John Worsfold, the captain of those 2 premiership sides, is now leading from the coach's box. And he's starting to assemble a pretty formidable squad. They're good players like David Wirapunda, Beau Waters and Darren Glass, a contradictory surname if there ever was one, for the hardest to rock key defender. But this team lived and died by who lined up in the centre of the ground, possibly boasting the greatest midfield group of all time. Ben Cousins, the Prince of Perth, was one of the few bright spots for Eagles fans during their down years. Cousins was the eventual Brownlow medalist that season in 2005 and the Eagles captain at the time, and is one of the most talented players the game has seen. Chris Judd looked like a seasoned pro in his 2002 debut year, and he won a Brownlow medal in just his 3rd season. He used his explosive speed and skills to tear through opponents. Daniel Kerr, who by the sheer talent of Judd and Cousins was the 3rd string in that midfield. If he had been in any other team, he would have likely been the first choice midfielder, a multiple time best and fairest winner, and possibly a Brownlow medalist as well, having finished runner-up to Cousins by 1 vote in 2005. Dean Cox was not only one of the greatest ruckmen of all time, but a man who went on to redefine what it meant to play the position. He gave first service to his star-studded midfield group, and basically played as an extra midfielder, utilising the incredible speed and athleticism he possessed for a man his size. Andrew Embley, a future Norm Smith medalist in his own right, Chad Fletcher and Michael Braun rounded out the stacked cast. If we cross over to the Swans, despite having existed since 1874, their situation at the time was comparable in some ways to the Eagles. Just 5 years before the Eagles entered the VFL, the South Melbourne Swans played all their home games in Sydney in 1982. This was followed by them moving their operations there and rebranding as the Sydney Swans. But the Swans didn't experience the same immediate success that the Eagles had as an interstate club. Unfortunately, the on-field and financial struggles that originally saw them relocate began to emerge in Sydney as well. But things eventually started to turn around for the Swans, headlined by them recruiting Tony Plugger Lockett. They had a chance to break their then 63-year-long premiership drought in 1996, but they were unable to do it. Late in 2002, when Rodney Eade, the coach who took them to that grand final, resigned, Paul Roos took over as caretaker coach. Like Worsfold, Roos had played for the Swans, and despite the board having a deal virtually locked in with former Bulldogs coach Terry Wallace, a groundswell of support from the fans and players saw Roos later made the permanent coach. And Roos continued to prove people wrong. When many journalists tipped that the Swans would finish last on the ladder in 2003, Channel 10 felt the need to ask for an apology on their behalf from every one of those journalists that night before the broadcast of the preliminary final between the Swans and the Lions. That very season in 2005, AFL CEO Andrew Demetrio publicly called the Swans' defensive style of play ugly and unattractive. But the Swans had genuine stars like Michael O'Loughlin, whose strength and athleticism made him a nightmare for opposing backmen, and Adam Goodes, the 2003 Brownlow medalist, who was one of the only men who could not only say that he could play in any position on the ground, but dominate there as well. It's also during this time that the Bloods culture really started to develop. A policy of targeting talented but underappreciated players from other clubs saw them recruit the likes of Barry Hall, Craig Bolton, Darren Jolly and Nick Davis. So now that we're all caught up, we can continue. In a game where momentum in the league consistently shifted, the Eagles managed to kick 5 goals in the final quarter to run away as 4-point winners. So West Coast got the week off and beat Adelaide in the preliminary final to punch their ticket to the grand final, while Sydney took the longer road around. They created some more historic moments that season after a nail-biting win over Geelong in the semi-final, and went on to beat St Kilda in the preliminary final the next week, setting up a rematch with West Coast. Sydney had a 2-point lead at quarter time, and then the two teams went about exchanging roles for the next 2 quarters. Sydney kicked 3 goals in the second quarter while holding West Coast goalless, but West Coast did the reverse in the third quarter, kicking 3 goals themselves while holding Sydney goalless to set up a tight finish. Sydney had the lead in the final minutes of the game, and sometimes you just have to let the moment speak for itself, or Stephen Quartermain in this case.
Cox throws it onto the left. One last roll of the dice for the Eagles! Leo Barry, you star! Bob Murray, reincarnate. The longest premiership drought in football history is over. For the first time in 72 years, the Swans are champions of the AFL.
The teams would next meet in round 15 at Subiaco Oval, and the Eagles were able to get their revenge. Despite trailing by over 5 goals at half time, they managed to peg the margin back. Despite only leading the game for the first time late in the final quarter, it was enough to get them over the line. We proceed to that year's final series, and it's deja vu all over again. West Coast are hosting Sydney in a qualifying final at home, but things play out a bit differently this time. The game was like a seesaw, with momentum in the league constantly changing. The lead changed 6 times in the final quarter, so you just know we need another epic moment to finish off a game of this magnitude.
And Sydney are on the build. This looks dangerous. Malcheski, good placement. Banfield the fist. O'Loughlin has got it. He's gold, and the Swans are back in front. His 4th. Sydney lead by a point.
Half back, Kennelly was part of it, and then the long kick again to just 2-on-2. Bit of a bounce goes your way. Michael O'Loughlin puts the ball through. What a game.
And then exchanged pleasantries with a few of the locals.
We keep speaking about it, but the space, have a look at Michael O'Loughlin getting in the face of the West Coast supporters. It's great stuff. This is one of the best games I've ever seen.
So this time Sydney got the easier path to the grand final, having a week off and then beating Fremantle in the prelim, while West Coast went through the Western Bulldogs and Adelaide to make it back there. In the grand final rematch, West Coast held a 25-point lead at half time, which the Swans tried to peg back for the rest of the game. They slowly ate away at that margin, ensuring another classic finish, and like before, sometimes you just need to let Anthony Hudson take over.
The West Coast Eagles lead by a point. Can the Swans do it? Siren! 2006, and the Stars, Cousins and Christian now have the medal they really want to put around their neck.
So the Eagles got revenge for the year before, and Andrew Embley won the Norm Smith medal. We proceed to the 2007 season, and the final match in this classic series. Like the grand final the year prior, West Coast have a strong 6-goal lead at half time, which Sydney managed to come back from, setting up another nail-biting finish where the Eagles just got over the line by 1 point, like in the 2006 grand final. Later that season, the two teams had the audacity to let one of their games winning margins exceed single digits and a goal, when West Coast beat Sydney by 12 points in round 16. And from here on out, the rivalry starts to quiet down a bit. Like after their last grand final run, West Coast again experienced a drop down the ladder, likely accelerated by their two biggest stars departing at the end of 2007. They finished second last on the ladder in 2008. But like before, this clears the way for another great team to emerge. The Swans experienced a dip of their own, but theirs was not as dramatic as West Coast. They still made the finals, but their status is now more around the mark, rather than being true premiership contenders. That is until they build a 9-year final streak from 2010 to 2018, which includes 3 grand finals and 1 premiership. While a rivalry still lingers from that incredible 6-game period, it hasn't reached those same heights. And this hasn't been for a lack of trying either. Since that final 6th game in 2007, both teams have won a premiership and made multiple grand finals, but their paths have never crossed in the finals since. There have definitely been moments which have reignited those old flames though, like Barry Hall making a future career for himself as a boxer, the loud booing of Adam Goodes by the West Coast fans, or Buddy Franklin christening the freshly built Optus Stadium in Perth with a bag of 8 goals. But the magic of those 6 special games hasn't been recaptured since, and likely never will be by any two teams. So why do I call this the perfect rivalry? On the surface it should be pretty obvious. You have 6 games which included 2 finals and the biggest day on the sporting calendar in Australia, all decided by less than 1 goal. The combined margin of those 6 games only adds up to 13 points, but I think the meaning of the word perfect goes a little deeper than that here. Often with a great rivalry, there's a feeling that there has to be a definitive winner and loser, but sometimes splitting the spoils can be just as rewarding. For a rivalry that was defined by its closeness, it's fitting that both teams came out with a premiership each. You could make the case that West Coast are the winners of this rivalry, since they won 4 out of the 6 games, but I think of it a bit differently. Both teams and fan bases got to experience the jubilation of winning a grand final, and the pain of losing one. Sydney's premiership was defined by breaking a 72-year-long drought, while West Coast was made sweeter for getting revenge for the year prior. Both sides got to ride the wave of emotions. This is even reflected by those involved in this epic rivalry. Paul Roos said that it would have been unlucky for either team to not get a premiership, and former Sydney Swans player Adam Snyder said about the rivalry, "The best thing about it looking back is both teams got to win one. If you were to book or script the perfect rivalry, this would be it. To experience all the pain, heart-stopping moments and joy associated with it, both teams got to share in this equally. A rivalry so tightly balanced on such a thin edge that one moment in either of those grand finals going the other way would completely redefine the way we look at these teams in this rivalry. For the thrills, closeness, pain and ecstasy, this rivalry was everything that we love about sports. It was absolutely perfect."